All right, so Ruth chapter 1, we spent quite a bit of time last week introducing the book of Ruth, considering it especially in its time, during the time of the judges when every man did what was right in his own eyes. We also talked a little bit about the narrative context of Ruth. Remember that Ruth is a very short book, but there's a lot of details, and every one of those details is important and significant. So we considered this, and then we walked through the first several verses of chapter 1. We saw Elimelech, right, and his two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. They go to the fields of Moab during a famine in Israel. They end up dying, all three of them, but not before Mahlon and Chilion had married Ruth and Orpah. And then after the sons died, after Elimelech died, they basically made the decision, or Naomi made the decision, it's time to return to Bethlehem. Remember, the Lord had looked upon his people, he had paid attention to them, and therefore they went back to Bethlehem, the house of bread. And yet Naomi begged her daughters-in-law, do not come with me. The prospects in Bethlehem are low. People are not going to like that you're Moabites. People are not going to look at you with favor. Go back to your mother's houses. Go back to your gods and to your people. And where we basically stopped was Ruth refused to do what Naomi said. But Orpah said, you know what, I love you, and we believe that, right? That Orpah truly loved Naomi, there were tears shed, and yet Ruth says, no, I will cling to you, your God will be my God, your people will be my people. And that's essentially where we left off. Now, as we just come back to this story, we're going to go back just a minute to verse 12, and actually verse 11. I'm going to read this and kind of just speed us up for the takeoff to get back into the end of chapter 1 and then move on to chapter 2. So verse 11, let's just dive into it. Naomi replied, return home, my daughters. Why do you want to go with me? Am I able to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. Go on, for I'm too old to have another husband. And even if I thought there was still hope for me to have a husband tonight and to bear sons, would you be willing to wait for them to grow up? Would you restrain yourselves from remarrying? No, my daughters, my life is much too bitter for you to share because the Lord's hand has turned against me. Now, this is important. We made the claim last week that Naomi is truly the protagonist of this story. It's primarily, we call it the book of Ruth, but Naomi is the one that really the book centers on. And we're going to see that as we go through chapter 2 as well. I'll point it out as we go by. But Naomi is the one who goes to her daughters-in-law, and she essentially says, the Lord's hand has turned against me. Now, let's just kind of come on level ground for a moment. Have you ever felt that way? And I don't mean, well, okay, spiritually, yes, I know I have favor with God. All the promises are yes and amen in Christ. We get that, right? Naomi got that too. But in that moment, she felt like God's hand had truly turned against her. And this is something that's common in the human experience, but it's not necessarily common to articulate this. And here's just what I want to do. I want to remind all of us that in this moment, you know what God does not do? He does not zap Naomi with a holy lightning bolt. He does not say, oh, Naomi, I can't believe that you would think that of me. Why don't you assume the best rather than assuming the worst? He doesn't look at her and say she's faithless. He doesn't look at her and say she's sinful. No, Naomi is being honest. And in her honesty, she's telling her daughters-in-law, I truly believe it would be best for you, in your best interest, to go back to your home, go back to your people. My life is too bitter for you to share. Now, two things. First, that is a statement of her spiritual plight, but it's also a statement of her social and economic standing. Think of this. She's essentially saying to her daughters-in-law, I have no way to provide for you. I have no way to protect you. There are no prospects for you. If you follow me, you're following me into a life of poverty, a life of obscurity, a life of insecurity. You are following me to something that is not appealing at all. Go back to a place where you actually have a life. And that's the context where then, as we continue, it says in verse 14, again they wept loudly, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And Naomi said, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Follow your sister-in-law. Now, just tuck that away in your mind. Again, every detail, every word, every statement is important. And what we're going to find a little bit later in Ruth chapter 2 is that Boaz, when he comes to Ruth, he is going to say, I have heard everything that you've done for your mother-in-law, how you have left your land and you have left your people. And we tend to, in our minds and in our culture, we tend to, in a sense, disassociate people to some degree with their land and maybe even to some degree with their country. We don't necessarily assume that every single person, because they're an American, is a Christian. Or we might not assume that just because someone is from another country, they necessarily share the faith of that country. Now, just let it sink in for a moment, though. We still do that to a large degree, don't we? And if I were to say, well, this person is from Iran, or if this person is from China, we tend to associate nationalities with certain religions, don't we? Right? The main religion in China is what? Buddhism. The main religion in Iran is what? Muslim, right? Islam. And as we think about this is something we still do. We still tend to associate where you live with who you worship. By the way, this is true of other countries as well. They assume that if someone is from the United States, they are Christian. Now that's a scary thought, isn't it? I mean, just think about that for a moment. And this is part of the reason why, just culturally speaking, it's very dangerous, isn't it, when people assume that things that come out of Hollywood or other cultural products of the United States represent what Christianity is. But that's absolutely true. Go back to your people. Why? Because Naomi knows, my people are going to assume things about you. My people are going to look at you as a Moabite. And in fact, as we read through the book of Ruth, she is referred to as Ruth the Moabitess, Ruth the Moabitess, Ruth the Moabitess. As we're going to see in just a minute, whenever she goes into the fields of Boaz, and then Boaz comes to her and says to his servant who oversees the field, who is this young woman? The first thing the servant is going to say is what? She is a woman of Moab descent who has come, he says it twice, from the land of Moab. When he sees her, the first thing he sees is Moabite, 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 Moabite. This is what Naomi knows that Ruth would have to overcome. So she says, go back. But Ruth clung to her, and Ruth replied, don't plead with me to abandon you or to return and not follow you, for wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. She's going over every objection. She says, no, your people, my people. Your land, my land. Where you live, I'll live. Where you die, I'll die. Your God will be my God. We talked about this last week, but the point is to think about all of the different social, spiritual barriers that Ruth was aware of and yet did not care about. And that's important because a lot of times, it's kind of funny. A lot of times people will agree to get into something for the exact reason that they don't understand what they're getting into, right? Yes, I will say yes because I have no clue what I'm saying yes to. This happens all the time. And it happens all the time, by the way, in sometimes major decisions. And yet here what we see, the author is emphasizing these details to tell us Ruth was not naive. Ruth was going into this open-eyed. But she says, your people will be my people. Your land will be your land. Where you live, I will live. Your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. May the Lord punish me and do so severely if anything but death separates me and you. And when Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped talking to her. Okay? So here we see the determination. We see that Ruth has a grit, a stubbornness. She's not going to be deterred even by her mother-in-law. She says, no, even if the odds are not in my favor, I am going to trust in the power and the protection of your God. And don't we see the irony here, right? In a way that Naomi herself doesn't necessarily trust. I'm going to trust in the name of the Lord God of Israel. And so she goes. Verse 19, it says, the two of them traveled until they came to Bethlehem. And when they entered Bethlehem, the whole town was excited about their arrival. And the local women exclaimed, can this be Naomi? Now think of this. It's been a significant period of time. They were 10 years gone in the land of Moab. But 10 years in a small town is not really enough to be forgotten. And by the way, Naomi knew this as well. Naomi knew that she was going to go back and she was going to be around all of the people that she had been around all of her life, or at least since she had been married to Elimelech. Now, think of this from Naomi's perspective, because this is going to be so important. This is going to be so important in the book of Ruth to understand this principle. The Israelite culture was an honor and shame culture. It's very different from the way that we operate and the way that we think, at least in certain ways. This is a small aside. I'm actually convinced that there are systems of honor and shame in our culture that really lurk beneath the surface that we don't see or articulate. But when I say an honor and shame culture, we can think of a classic honor and shame culture like China or Japan, some of the Eastern countries that still operate in an explicit honor-shame context. And you can think of this, right? The Japanese had what? The code of Bushido. That if someone, that you would rather die than dishonor your family. You would rather die than dishonor your family name. Honor is going to be incredibly important when we consider the idea of continuing the line of Mahlon and Chilion, or continuing the line of Elimelech even though they had died. Honor is incredibly important in the Israelite culture, as it is in almost all Eastern cultures. But think of that from the negative standpoint of Naomi having to go back in shame, right? She goes back in shame because she's lost her husband. She goes back in shame because she's lost her children. But she also goes back in shame because she left all of the people who stayed. Have you ever experienced this in your life, where when times get tough and certain people fall away and go away, and then they try to come back and act like nothing happened? Naomi understands. She is not expecting a warm reception. She is not expecting that people are going to be like, oh, poor Naomi. You know, you tried your hand over in Moab, but it didn't work out. Welcome home. No, Naomi comes, and based on her own circumstances, but also based upon how she knows the honor-shame system works, she knows that people are not going to look at her and look at her with sympathy. And as we look at these women, it's very interesting. Or even if Naomi wanted that, she had no right to expect it based upon her decision to leave with Elimelech. It would have been seen, in a sense, as desertion. It would have been seen as, you have left your family, you have left God's family, you went to Moab, and now you're coming back. But what do we see? The local women exclaimed, can this be Naomi? And she says, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, she answered, for the Almighty has made me very bitter. The word Mara means bitter. Now it's interesting, we're familiar in the Bible, aren't we, with name changes? Going all the way back to Abram, who God changes his name to Abraham. Or we think of Isaac, we think of Jacob rather, God changes his name to Israel. Okay? It's interesting. This is the only example that I'm aware of, and I'd love for you to correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the only example I'm aware of where a person changes their name only then to have the name changed back to their original name, right? She says, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. This is not God changing her name, but this is Naomi saying that God has changed my destiny. Now think about this for a moment. Even the fact that she's changing her name shows that's, I don't think that's meant to be like a hyperbolic statement of, oh yeah, this is my new nickname. No, she's saying, I don't even want you to think of me as the same person I was when I left, right? I want you to consider me a different person. I am changing my name to Mara because my destiny and my identity is bitterness. Don't call me Naomi anymore. That's not who I am. That's who I left as, but that's not who I've come back as. Call me Mara. In verse 21, and notice how bold she is. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Now, this thought I've never thought about before. So I'm going to play it, I'm going to rehearse it out loud with you for a second. How do you think that makes Ruth feel? Yeah, bad and little bitty, right? And she says I came back empty, but isn't it fascinating? I think there's something here. Isn't it fascinating? By the time you get to the end of the book of Ruth, what do the women, the same people she's talking to at this point, what do the women in Ruth chapter 4 say to her about Ruth? They say, is it not true that Ruth is better to you than 7 sons? That's a kind of a fascinating link, right? I have come back empty. And we know what she means by that. She has no money, she has no land, or at least she doesn't have the ability to work the land that she might have a right to. She doesn't have sons, she doesn't have a husband. So in that sense, she is empty. But she does have Ruth. And Ruth is there with her. And as she comes, she says, why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has opposed me and the Almighty has afflicted me? She places the blame squarely on God. Now, notice God's silence, at least in the sense of no verbal articulation, but we've already said, and I want to just put it in your mind again, she has already invoked a blessing, the name of the Lord, on Ruth as well as Orpah, saying, may you find rest in the house of a husband. Even in her brokenness, she prays. We're going to look at a few more prayers tonight in chapter 2. But as she comes, she says, the Lord has afflicted me. The Lord has made me empty. The Lord has brought this on me. And by the way, she may have felt that as a kind of punishment or a retribution for her leaving the land of Israel, right? It's not for no reason that she thought and claimed that the Lord's hand was against her. She had, after all, left the land of promise. She had left the house of bread, literally, to go to the land of Moab, a place where they worship foreign gods. At which point she said, well, God did tell me if you disobey, if you go outside of my presence, what can you expect? But in her mind, she makes the same mistake that many people make. I'll throw out a technical term for you, but it's worth knowing. There's something in the Old Testament called the retributive principle. And it's basically this, that most people in ancient Israel believed that essentially you reap what you sowed. If you do wrong, retribution, retributive principle, right? Obey, blessing, disobey, curse. But here's the problem. Even though that's clear in certain instances, and God says it at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, obey and you will receive blessing, disobey and you will receive curses. What happens whenever those who are righteous suffer? How do we explain it? How is it the case that sometimes there are people who are clearly doing what God wants them to do, and yet they seem to be experiencing the punishment of God? This is the entire premise of what? The story of Job. Job essentially says, here's your retributive principle, and I'm just going to push it back on you. Why do I say that? Because what did Job's friends do? They go to him over and over. And these are pretty good friends as far as friends go. At least in one sense, they sit with Job for 7 days before they say anything. They empathize with him in his grief. They try to come to him. They try to do the best they can based on what they know. But what do every one of the friends say to him, at least in various ways? They say, Job, you had to have done something wrong. You may not even know what you did wrong. You may not understand what you did wrong, but you had to do something wrong. Why? Because they believe the retributive principle, the idea that God punishes you for the bad things you do. They said it's always true. And Job says it's not always true. And of course, what does the reader of Job know? This is the irony of the book of Job. The reader knows something that neither Job nor his friends know. That it is not Job's lack of righteousness that has caused this. It's actually Job's righteousness that has brought it upon him. And this is, someday it'd be fun to go through the book of Job. I don't know that we'll do that because it's super long. But here's the essence of it. Most people, I think a lot of people forget, they think that Satan came to God and said, hey, God, I want to attack Job. That's not what happens. God is the one who brought Job up. The sons of God are coming from going to and fro on the earth, and God says to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? God's the one who starts it. And it was not because he was unrighteous that Job suffered. It was actually because he was righteous. But here's the point. When you're in the midst of it, this is I would place money right now that every single one of us has experienced this idea that when something bad happens, is God punishing me? That is the human tendency, that is human nature. It's to assume that bad things are caused by bad things that I have done. We naturally try to connect the dominoes between my sin and the punishment or the circumstances that I'm experiencing in this moment. That's what Naomi did. And yet, the wisdom literature in particular of the Old Testament, but also the stories, remind us It's just not true. It's not true that all pain and suffering in the world can be directly linked to a sin that we've done. And I just want you to hear that because, one, we live on the other side of the cross, so we have an even deeper reason to think that. My sin, oh, the bliss of this glorious thought, my sin not in part but the whole, is nailed to the cross, and I bear it no more. Guilt and shame are something that Christians should never experience long term. We sin, we repent, we feel the guilt, we feel the shame, we nail it to the cross, and by the grace of God, we are empowered to move on. But our experience comes back and says, well, wait a second. I still feel that way. And God says, you may feel that way, but it's not true. That's why Paul says, don't be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be renewed in your mind. Let your mind be renewed. Let your mind be transformed. We preach the gospel to ourselves just as much as we preach it to anyone. And yet, here's the thought. Naomi knows that in her heart, she feels like she's being punished. The hand of the Almighty is against me. And of course, the implication is, what can you do against the hand of God? What can you do if God is against you? By the way, just to sharpen this point just a little bit, this is how David felt. I mean, think of how confusing it was for David. David, anointed by God as the king by Samuel, goes and defeats Goliath, does amazing things. Talk about spiritual high. Followed by years of fleeing in the wilderness, running for your life. If anybody had a right to say, God, what on earth are you doing? It was David. And yet David had to go through that time of suffering, that time of questioning, that time when he says things like, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? This is David pouring out his heart saying, God, I don't get it. This is Naomi in the midst of her, and this is where the Bible is so real, right? It's so easy just to read a verse and then move on. Naomi's having a hard time. Yes, Naomi's having a hard time, but no, it's like Naomi's life has completely fallen apart and she thinks it's totally God's doing. Meanwhile, what she doesn't even know is they happen to be strolling into Bethlehem, as we're going to see in a minute, at exactly the right time when God wanted them to stroll into Bethlehem. Let's keep going. So Naomi, verse 22, came back from the territory of Moab with her daughter-in-law, Ruth the Moabitess. There it is again, Ruth the Moabitess. They arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. They just happened to be there at the time when they would be able to go into the fields to find food. That's God's provision. But also, as we're going to see, they happen to go, or Ruth happens to go to exactly the right field. Chapter 2. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side. He was a prominent man of noble character from Elimelech's family. His name was Boaz. Interesting descriptions. First of all, the relative is on her husband's side. That's significant. Why? Because when it comes to the responsibility that Boaz had, the responsibility was not directly to Naomi, but it was to Naomi through marriage. Now, there's still a responsibility, but Boaz would have been within his rights to say, you know what? Elimelech left. And Naomi, she's not my blood, right? She may be my blood's wife, but she's not my blood. And her sons, who were my blood, they're gone too. So that's significant. But what we read here is Boaz is a prominent man. That could speak to his wealth, but it says he's a prominent man of noble character. And this phrase, of noble character, is important. It could indicate some kind of like strength or prominence or wealth. But like the translation noble character, I think gets at it pretty closely. It's the idea that he is a man who is righteous. And this is particularly important because remember, time of the judges, this is the time when every man does what is right in his own eyes. Boaz, in other words, is the kind of man who even when other people around him see that it is advantageous to set aside the law and live for themselves, Boaz is the kind of man that says, no, even when other people are doing what's right in their own eyes, I'm going to seek the law of God. It reminds you a little bit of Joshua, right? You remember Joshua? Whenever Joshua says, choose this day whom you'll serve, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Boaz was the kind of man that said, for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. Boaz was the kind of man who wasn't afraid to swim upstream. He wasn't afraid to stand up for what he knew was right. And by the way, the word Boaz is likely related to the word strength. So his name probably means something like strong or strength. This could indicate, some people argue that this indicates that Boaz had a kind of military history. That Boaz may not have just been a nobleman, but he also might have been a strong man, perhaps with a military background, that would have been able to actually provide the kind of protection that he eventually does provide for Ruth. But just notice, chapter 2, verse 1, this kind of like subtle introduction to Boaz. Okay? All right, verse 2. Oh, also, no, before I move on, I mentioned this last week, but I just want to point it out because I think it's important. Matthew 1:5 says that Boaz is the son of Rahab. And again, just as we think about this, as we think about that fact, it really does tell us something in terms of Boaz being willing to see Ruth through a different set of eyes, perhaps because he knew what it was like for other people to see him through a different set of eyes, right? That if he was the product of a harlot, Rahab, who despite her own people, right? Where was Rahab from? Jericho. She was a Canaanite. I don't know that we know her ethnicity explicitly, but she was a Canaanite. She was a harlot. She lived there. She was around men who were rough and tumble. Jericho was likely a military fortress. She was around people who were people of the night. She was around people who were people of the world, right? This was Rahab, but Rahab's son Boaz saw her not as a harlot, but as someone who literally went against all of her people and said, I'm going to trust in the power and the protection of the Lord. And because of that, God what? Brought her into his people, at which point, Ruth doesn't tell us this. We don't find this out till Matthew. But that at least helps us to understand, perhaps in some ways, how his character was formed, how his story was written. So Boaz is a different kind of man. He's not a man of his times. He's a man who goes against his times. But let's keep going. Verse 2, Ruth the Moabitess, there it is again, right up front. And lest we again think that this is some kind of like irrelevant detail, the narrator could have easily struck that from the record. You know, this is I may have told this joke before, so if I repeat it, I'm sorry. But Barack Obama, right? Barack Obama's middle name is what? Barack Hussein Obama. Yes? You've heard what Barack Obama said when someone asked him who named him Barack Hussein Obama. You remember his response? They said, Barack, your middle name is Hussein. Who named you Hussein? And his response was, no one who ever thought I'd run for president of the United States, that's for sure, right? That was his response. Why? Because Hussein doesn't work well in the polls, does it? No. And that's just real. That's the world of politics. Same thing. Ruth the Moabitess, I'm going to sharpen this point. It might make us a little uncomfortable, but think about this. When Barack Obama ran for president, you remember this? You saw signs that maybe said Obama, but you saw signs that said what? Hope, change, rainbows, blue, all the rest. You remember this? You remember all this? You know what you did not see? You did not see a sign that said Barack Hussein Obama for president. They never made one. And if they made it, they would have destroyed it. Why? Because they know that's going to cause people not to vote for him. They're not dumb. This would have been the equivalent of putting Barack Hussein Obama on a sign. Ruth the Moabitess. This is what you want people to forget, but the narrator is putting it right in front of our faces. Don't forget she's a Moabitess. Don't forget it because no one who looked at her would have forgotten it. Ruth the Moabitess, chapter 2, verse 2, Ruth the Moabitess asked Naomi, will you let me go into the fields and gather fallen grain behind someone with whom I find favor? The law of Moses in both the book of Leviticus as well as the book of Deuteronomy provides laws that basically say when you harvest or glean in a field, don't harvest all the way to the corners of the field. You have to leave the corners for the poor and the widow, the foreigners who don't have any land, who don't have any recourse. You have to leave the corners for them. Also, as you reap, you go through, and whatever you get on the first cut, you reap it. But anything that's left behind, again, anything that falls to the ground, don't pick it up. Anything that's left behind, don't go back for it. Leave it for the foreigners. It's actually really interesting in the book of Deuteronomy when they're harvesting from trees. Here's what they say. They say, shake it out. But once you shake it out the first time, anything that's left, leave it. This was their social welfare system. It's not a perfect analogy, but this was their security blanket for the poor who could not provide for themselves. Which is why Ruth knew this, and she said, can I just go to a field where someone will allow me to harvest? Now think about this. This is, again, a time when every man did what was right in his own eyes. Not everyone would have followed this. There would have been some people that said, I don't care what Leviticus says. I don't care what Deuteronomy says. Get out of my field, you dirty Moabite. Unless you think that's an overreaction, just trust me, it's not. That's why she says, may I go glean in the field of someone with whom I find favor? And Naomi answered her, go ahead, my daughter. Notice, again, the details. The details are where the book is so rich. Naomi no longer calls her daughter-in-law, does she? Go, my daughter. She does call her the daughter-in-law earlier, but now we see this relationship. Go, my daughter. She also, by the way, asks Naomi's permission, and Naomi grants it. But, as it says in verse 3, so Ruth left, and she entered the field to gather grain behind the harvesters, and she happened to be in the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was from Elimelech's family. What we're going to see is there's going to be a lot of coincidences in the book of Ruth. They happened to come back at the time of the barley harvest. She happened to go in the field of Boaz. And what we're meant to see here is the hand of God working itself through every single detail of this. Naomi says that God's hand is against her, but what we see is that God's hand is for her at every turn. And this is something that when you're hurting and you can't see it, there's no way to wave the magical wand and be able to see it. You know that? Like, you can't do that. And sometimes people try to force people to see, I'm sure this is going to work out for good. Well, I'm sure it is too, but right now it stinks. And that the point is that there are things that God does that we cannot see. It's not just that we don't see them, it's that we can't see them. This is why it's called faith. But she happens to go to Boaz's field. And later in verse 4, when Boaz arrived from Bethlehem, he said to the harvesters, the Lord be with you, the Lord bless you, they replied. Now, I think this is important because as we think about Boaz, the first thing that Boaz says is what? A blessing. He was a man who didn't just follow the Lord, he is a man who blessed the workers in the name of the Lord. He goes out and he says, the Lord be with you. This is a man of God. This is what it means to be a man of noble character. He's a man who loves the Lord, who invokes the name of the Lord. And what does it say as a return? The Lord bless you. Now, I really believe this blessing is again something that is eventually going to be answered. How so? Well, the people of Abraham are going to be blessed. How? The people of Bethlehem are going to become the place, the hometown of King David. Think about this. Of all the lands in Israel, or all of the towns in Israel, what are the two most famous? Jerusalem, got to be number one on the list. But after that, Bethlehem. Listen, Bethlehem was a nobody from nowhere, no one cared about, small, tiny place. But because of Boaz and Ruth, these blessings come to fruition. The people of Bethlehem are honored as those who are the house and the line of David. This is why, by the way, Bethlehem doesn't go away from this point. Bethlehem is exalted. Bethlehem is blessed. The Lord bless you, he says to the workers, or the Lord be with you, they say. The Lord bless you, they replied. Boaz asked his servant who was in charge of the harvesters, "Whose young woman is this?" Now, it's an interesting question. In our culture, that may feel a little bit sharp. Whose young woman is this? Is this Boaz seeing her as property? As we're going to see, the answer to that's no. But in their culture, a woman was associated essentially uniformly with a man. Why? Because they had to be in the house of a father or in the house of a husband. This was seen as their status. It was seen as their protection. It was seen as their honor. Otherwise, they were a widow. Or in this case, as we're going to see, Ruth was a widow, but as we're going to see, she was the kind of widow that was very unusual. She was a young widow. But he says, whose young woman is this? Now, again, just if you're Boaz, here's what you would have seen. Here's how you would have noticed Ruth. You would have seen your harvesters who were going along first, and they're reaping, right? They're gleaning. And you would have seen Ruth following behind, not getting too close, kind of staying behind in the shadows, picking up the leftovers of what she can. It would have been very conspicuous, would have been very obvious, even as Ruth, I'm sure, would have preferred to be unnoticed and unseen. Boaz sees her, and so he's essentially saying, what's the story? What's going on here? Whose young woman is this? And what does the servant say? Verse 6, the servant answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the territory of Moab." I mentioned it earlier, right? The twofold emphasis. She's the Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the territory of Moab. Again, he sees her, Moabite, 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 alert. Implication, Mr. Boaz, sir, if you want me to take care of this, that's why I'm here, right? Moabite woman. But in verse 7, she asked, "Will you let me gather fallen grain among the bundles behind the harvesters?" She came and has been on her feet since early morning, except that she rested a little in the shelter. Now, this is where it's a little bit fuzzy, but I'll at least present to you what I think is going on here. It's obvious, what's very clear is that Ruth is a hard worker. And we understand this because she wants to survive. Naomi and Ruth have nothing. And she's got to be out there because the instant that it falls, she's got to be able to pick it up so that she can take something for herself and Naomi to eat that night. She's in a dire situation. She's desperate. Therefore, she doesn't take breaks, right? She goes for it. Anybody ever seen that movie, what is it, The Pursuit of Happiness with Will Smith? Anybody ever seen that movie? It reminds me of that. There's a scene in that movie that essentially there's a guy who's trying to make it in the corporate world. In order to best the other interns, he doesn't take any breaks. He doesn't drink water so that he doesn't have to take bathroom breaks. So that essentially, anyway, go watch the movie. It'll make sense. Ruth doesn't take breaks. She's standing, she's working. And in doing this, by the way, she is building a reputation for herself. She's a hard worker. She cares about her mother-in-law. She's trying to take care of her, but also the implication could be, and I think it's there, she has been on her feet all day except for a little while. Here's what she knows. She knows no one. She doesn't know that this is the field of Boaz. She doesn't know that we know it. She doesn't know that. She doesn't know the reputation of the young men who work in this field. She doesn't, and think about this. She has no one to protect her, right? The women in the room might be able to relate to this. Have you ever been placed or been in a moment or a situation where you felt very vulnerable? I'll tell you a funny story. Many of you know Ryan and Liz Emmerich. They're not here, so I'll pick on them. We were with Ryan and Liz one night. We went to see Nate Bargatze, a comedy show. And so we drove to Tulsa to go see it. We ate at this restaurant beforehand. We had to walk I think a mile or something down the road to get to this theater from the restaurant. And so we're there. We park, and there's literally this homeless guy that's walking by. Maybe I shouldn't tell this part of the story, but I will. There's a guy who I shouldn't say we knew he was homeless. He appeared to be homeless, but he also appeared to be, as much as you can tell, a nice guy, and he happened to be wearing a shirt that had the name of the arena that we were trying to get to, okay? So what do? I was in my mind like, clearly this guy knows where this place is. There's no question in my mind. We don't know where we're supposed to go. He does know where we're supposed to go. And so what do? Hey, pal, I see your shirt. That's where we're trying to get to. Can you tell us how to get there? And I'm telling you, Liz Emmerich, as fast as she could, just starts walking and leaving me behind. It's like all of a sudden we didn't know each other. She thought, and she still does, she laughed at me. She said, I cannot believe you did that. I was like, what? He's a human being. And guess what he did? He's like, well, actually, you take it up here, you turn left up there, take a right. I was like, thank you, have a good day. He walks off happy, I walk off happy. Liz, not so happy. But here's what happened in the restaurant. Ryan Emmerich, whom some of you guys know, Ryan is like 6'3", broad frame, big guy, right? We're in the restaurant, and they're kind of looking on their phone. There's an app on your phone. I forget what it's called. It's called like Death Paths or something. Liz, if you don't know Liz works for a Fortune 500 company. I won't mention it because it's going on the internet. I don't want to get her in trouble. Not that it would. But she works for a company. She travels all over the place. So she has this app on her phone. If she's in a major city for a meeting, she has this app on her phone so that she doesn't walk in a place where there's known to have been crimes committed. Literally, it's an app that tells you a crime has been committed at this point. Don't walk in this way. So we don't know, again, we don't know where we are. We don't know exactly how to get there. So Ryan the waiter comes over. And Ryan, who again, big guy, like 6'3", he says, hey man, we're walking down to this such and such place. Do you think we're going to be okay to do that at night? It's about to get dark. You think we'll be okay? And this waiter, I can't even explain his face. He looks at Ryan. He looks him up and down. He's like, honestly, pal, he says, I think you're going to be just fine. Like no one is going to mess with you, right? You are fine. At which point we all had a good laugh at that. We're like, okay, But here's the point. It's so interesting. If that were me and Ryan, we wouldn't have thought of it at all, honestly. But when you know that you have no recourse if someone does something to you, right? You know what I don't walk around with? Pepper spray in my purse because I don't have a purse. And if I did, I wouldn't put pepper spray in it, right? Or a taser, but this is the reality. Or you're like, pepper spray? I've got my Colt, whatever you happen to be carrying in your purse, right? I know the women in this room, right? We got some, they go. But here's the truth. Ruth had no protection. No one would have come to save her. No one would have cared. I really think that's probably what's going on. I think that's another reason why she stayed on her feet all day. Because the moment I take rest in a place that's shaded or protected is the moment that someone can take advantage of me. You say, well, are you overeating? No, I don't think so, because in just a minute we're going to read. Boaz says, I have told my young men not to take advantage of you. We talk about sexual harassment. They wouldn't have had those terms. This would have been something that was very much on the mind of a woman who had no one and nothing to protect her. She's a young woman. And there were people there who, again, this is the time when every man did what was right in their own eyes. There is no 911. There is no police. There's no one. And so let's just keep going. She only rested a little while in the shelter. And so Boaz comes to her. And this would have been unusual, by the way. This would have been, in essence, breaking of protocol. The idea that the owner of the field, a prominent, wealthy, well-respected man, goes to this Moabite scum. And by the way, again, I want it to be as sharp as it really is. The Moabites were not loved. They were hated. They were seen to be scandalous. They were seen to be temptresses. They were seductresses who led you astray. This is the kind of woman you don't want your son to meet and marry. But what does Boaz do? He breaks all protocol and he goes to her. And he said to Ruth, the first thing that Ruth hears from the lips of Boaz is, listen, my daughter. Pause. That phrase, my daughter, instantly is disarming, is it not? He treats her with respect, indicates his desire to protect her, to treat her with dignity, and in doing so shows, I'm not here to do anything. I'm here simply to help in whatever way I can. Listen, my daughter, he says. Don't go and gather grain in another field, and don't leave this one, but stay here close to my female servants. See which field they are harvesting and follow them. Haven't I ordered the young men not to touch you?" This is where, again, this is one of the reasons I think there's a connection between her being on her feet all day and Boaz's protection. The word touch in Hebrew is a euphemism for sexual touch, right? Boaz is, I mean, we still talk about this in our culture. We can say touch and it can have a sexual meaning in our culture, but particularly this is the way that Boaz would have said, "I have commanded them not to harass you. I want you to know that you are safe here, and I want you to be with my female servants, and I, on my honor, by my authority, I am Boaz, the owner of the field. I have commanded them not to touch you." Protect, and again, it's so easy to miss. For Ruth to have a place where she could have come and experienced protection would have meant everything to her. She had no guarantee of that, but she came to the right place. "Haven't I commanded them not to touch you? When you're thirsty, go and drink from the jars the young men have filled." We're going to talk about the reversal being complete in just a second, but think of this total reversal. Ruth goes to this field. She has no idea who anybody is. She has no idea if they're going to run her off. And all of a sudden, the owner of the field comes and says, "My daughter, I'm going to now treat you with honor. You're going to be like one of my female servants. I've commanded them to protect you. And by the way, it looks like you're probably thirsty. Go and drink from the jars that my young men fill." And again, in an honor and a shame culture, it's not just physical vulnerability, it's also status. It's also that everyone, think of this. It's very possible that the other people just ignored her. Like we think about shunning, right? What is shunning? It's refusing to look at someone in the eyes. If you wanted to shame someone in their culture, what would you do? You would turn your back on them. This is, by the way, something that has come across cultures. It's still kind of rude, right? If someone's talking to you and you turn your back to them, right? It's rude. This is just a random aside. This is what happened to Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. At least this is what the story goes, that they were in the Palace of St. James together, which is the Court of St. James in England. Jefferson and Adams would become bitter political rivals by the end, but they had a common experience while they were both diplomats where they were in the court of St. James, and what does it say? That the King of England, as he passed, turned his back on them as the ambassadors from America. The King of England was trying to shame them. It actually ended up forging them together. Here's my point. All the other people, they could have looked at Ruth like, "Who are you? We don't care about you. We are saving face by not associating ourselves with you." Boaz didn't care. Boaz did not care so much about his honor and his reputation that he wasn't willing to risk it by going to Ruth. And how do we know this? Because Ruth says, look at Ruth's reaction. Verse 10, "She fell face down, bowed to the ground, and said to him, 'Why have I found favor with you so that you notice me, although I'm a foreigner?'" Ruth understands this is not common. This is not usual. You should not be noticing me. This is woman at the well type stuff. You should not be talking to me. I should not be talking to you. Why on earth? She is literally face down on the ground. "Why are you noticing me?" And notice, she understands. She says, "Even though I'm a foreigner." She didn't overhear that servant, but she knew. "I know how you're supposed to think of me. I'm a Moabite. I know the glances, the looks that I've got from your head servant," who, again, just as a repeat, I'm a pastor. If you say it once, you got to say it 3 times. This is number 3. What did that servant say of Ruth? The Moabite woman who came from the territory of Moab. Ruth understood that. She said, "Why do you notice me, although I'm a foreigner?" And Boaz answered her, "Everything you've done for your mother-in-law since your husband's death has been fully reported to me, how you left your father and mother in your native land, and how you came to a people you didn't previously know." Notice again, I mentioned this, so I'm going to fly through it. Boaz doesn't just say, "I know your story." He says specifically, "I know what you've done for your mother-in-law." I love that. He says, "I know how you left your father and mother and your native land." Boaz here is indicating, I know that you have sacrificed security, status, your homeland, and your people. You have done it for the love of your mother-in-law. I've heard it. By the way, we don't know how Boaz heard it. We don't know if we got a shortened report of what the servant said to him. Maybe the servant knew. Maybe Boaz knew from the field. Boaz was the kind of man who seemed to know what was going on around Bethlehem, right? Maybe he went to the coffee shop at 6 in the morning and some other old guy told him. We don't know. We don't know, right? But Boaz knew. Boaz seems like the kind of guy who it was just his business to know stuff. And he says, I've heard. And then in verse 12, do not miss verse 12. May the Lord reward you for what you have done. And may you receive a full reward from the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. If you highlight in your Bible, great verse to highlight. Why? Because this is now the next prayer that becomes a catalyst for the fulfillment of Ruth's destiny. Notice what Boaz says. May the Lord reward you with a full reward because of what you've done, and may the Lord reward you under whose wings you have come for refuge. When we think of this image, God is presented as one who protects his people in the same way that an eagle or a bird comes and hovers over its young. You can see here I gave you a couple of instances. Deuteronomy 32, 10 and 11 is an important one. Why? Because it explicitly says of God's people, the people of Israel. He says, you are like a young bird, and I have come to protect you, to place you under the cover of my wings. Boaz, up front, is saying of Ruth, Ruth, you may think of yourself as a foreigner. These servants may think of you as a foreigner, but I see you as a potential follower of God. My prayer for you, my blessing over you, and the first conversation we've ever had is that you receive a full reward, and essentially what he's saying is, may you receive all the blessings of being a full Israelite, even though you're not. May you receive refuge under the wings of the Lord, under whose wings you have come for refuge. This is what he's saying. He's invoking that blessing. And in verse 13, she says, my Lord, she said, I have found favor with you, for you have comforted and encouraged your servant, although I'm not like one of your female servants. She's saying, I don't deserve this, right? And we love this back and forth, don't we? She gives honor to him. I'm not worthy of receiving your honor. This is the way that the honor shame game is played, right? If you are lesser in the honor culture, right? If you are in a lower rung, Ruth's deference to Boaz is exactly what she should have done. I'm not worthy, right? This is still true in honor and shame cultures. You recognize where you're at, you know your place. This is why, right? If you even watch something like Downton Abbey or other shows that talk about like the nobility system in England, you don't speak in a room until you're spoken to. This is Ruth saying, my Lord, I've found favor with you. You've comforted and encouraged. I'm not like one of your least servants. But then look at what Boaz does, and we'll end here. At mealtime, Boaz told her, come over here and have some bread and dip it in the vinegar sauce. Now, this is so fascinating because table fellowship, just like it was in the New Testament, table fellowship, it wasn't just having a meal. It was a symbol. It was a status symbol. Right? I mentioned Downton Abbey. Some of you may have watched that show. You've got the dining room upstairs and you've got the servants' quarters downstairs. Boaz is shredding all social propriety and saying, I am the owner, I am a man of honor, I am an Israelite and a noble man. You are a nobody, you are not even employed in my field, but come sit here with me. You, Moabite, dip your hand in the vinegar sauce with me. And then he goes on to say what? It says, so she sat beside the harvesters, and he offered her roasted grain. The picture is of Boaz himself serving Ruth. This is something where, who knows, maybe the servants over on the side are like, what is he thinking? What is he doing? I can't believe that Boaz, a man of honor, would abase himself with this destitute, horrible woman from the land of Moab. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Is this not exactly what happens with Jesus? What gets Jesus in trouble? There are a few main things that get Jesus in trouble. One of them, he chooses to do things on Saturdays on purpose. He heals on the Sabbath to prove a point. The next thing that gets him in trouble is what? Who he eats with. Do you not know that these are sinners? Do you not know that this is a Moabite? And yet Boaz offers her roasted grain. She receives a portion of the best served by Boaz himself. There's this incredible text. I can't remember. I don't remember where it is. Someone will have to look it up. It's in Luke, somewhere in 10, 11, 12, something like that, where it talks about Jesus. This is Jesus saying this. It's one of those things where unless Jesus said it, you wouldn't believe it. But he essentially says, in the kingdom, the Son of Man will himself have you set at a table, and he will serve you a meal. I mean, think about that for a minute. That Jesus demonstrated true greatness, true power, true nobility by having sinners and those who are unworthy sit at a table, and he himself will feed them. Boaz demonstrates this. As a man of honor, he looks at her, he offered her roasted grain, and then notice she ate and was satisfied and had some left over. This is an honor game. Boaz is trying to do everything in his power to show honor to someone that almost everyone else would have seen as dishonorable. And he does so, why? At least in part, I really believe, because he knew what it was like. This is reading into it. I'll admit this, but I don't think it's overreading. I can't help but think that when Boaz saw Ruth, he saw his mother. And I think it's because of that he said, you know what? I know what my mother was treated like. I am going to show this woman honor. And he did. And he didn't regret it. And guess what? Because of, think just for a second of God's perspective. God had to have loved this interaction. As God is looking at this, he looks at Boaz and says, that's the kind of man that I'm going to use. And he looks at Ruth and he says, that's the kind of faith that I'm going to bless. And this happens, by the way, some people are like, oh, is this where sparks fly? I don't think so. I really do think that Boaz is old and Ruth is young. We'll talk about that later. But this is a man who's willing to stop and show honor to a woman who had no right to expect it and didn't. And yet, think of this. In just that moment, her world is turned upside down. All right, I'll save. We have like 1 or 2 minutes for questions. We'll finish the rest of Ruth 2 next week, get into Ruth 3. This story is going to move forward quickly, but any thoughts or any questions before we end tonight? Yeah, Joe. Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That could be. It very well could have been. I totally agree with that. 2 things. The first thing you said, this is where it's very different. We tend to think of guilt as a personal thing. And the word you used is Naomi returned, she would have felt guilty. I don't think her primary emotion was guilt. I think it was shame, which is a different. Right, but still, in a shame culture, that didn't matter. Like in a shame culture, your shame, it's kind of like in an arranged marriage. This is still true in some parts of the world. A woman in an arranged marriage is there to please her husband. Let's say that the husband rejects her for something outside of her control. She's still going to feel ashamed. And not in a sense of I've done anything wrong, but I have failed to bring honor to my family. And that's where people differentiate between a culture where guilt is primary. And in the Western cultures, guilt, personal, individual guilt, is what's primary. In Eastern cultures, communal shame was what was primary. That's why, again, no detail is unimportant. That's why she said that when she saw the other women of Bethlehem. It wasn't about guilt. It was about she felt like she bore the shame of her husband's decision. And that was I'm glad you brought that up. That's true not just in this story. Think of Nabal and Abigail, right? Abigail, this is the story in 1 Samuel 25. Abigail realizes her husband's a fool. He's making really bad decisions, and what does she have to do? She has to intervene in order to save her life, but also in order to have any kind of honor. This is why David at the other side of it says, I want to marry a woman like that. But in their mind, and it's really hard for us to see, guilt and shame was not the same. I don't think she would have felt guilty. But because she had nothing, she would have felt ashamed, even though it wasn't her fault. And we feel that way. I mean, have you ever, you ever feel shame over something that's not your fault? Yeah, that happens all the time. But the second thing you said, I forgot it. Yes, okay, yes. I think the indication that we have, because I think it's possible that they would have been jealous. But what do we see? That Boaz was the kind of man who, as soon as he goes to the field, he greets his people. Right, he knew them. There seems to be, even that detail. The narrator didn't have to tell us this. Who cares? Boaz said hi to his workers. The workers said hi back. Who cares? Why include that? Here's why. Because I think the narrator wants to show us Boaz was the kind of man who really genuinely cared, not just about Ruth, but he was just a man who cared. And there's a huge difference, right? These are the type of people that we all want to work for and work with. People who genuinely care about us. And Boaz was that kind of man. This is what, from a literary standpoint, is known as characterization, right? You're building the traits of the character in your mind, and that's where these details are so important. This is, yeah. So those are two good insights, and I think they really draw something out. Okay. Any other question, real quick? We're past time, but we'll keep going in chapter 2 next week. Again, just let it settle on you. Honor and shame is going to be so important for the rest of the book. I'll hammer it several times. But thank you so much, and I'll see you next week.